This is LBC from Global, leading Britain's conversation with James O'Brien.
Hello, 3 minutes after 10 is the time. You are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Two by-elections yesterday, which the runes were quite hard to read. I think that they were particular by-elections, weren't they? Because they were both caused by the removal from the body politic of two of the... Well, I didn't know much about Chris Philp until I found out that he had been regularly accused of inappropriate sexual behaviour. Something, of course, that Boris Johnson knew all about when he decided to appoint him Deputy Chief Whip and then lied about when allegations emerged, or when more allegations emerged. And that, in the great scheme of things, it is easy to forget that that was actually the straw that broke the camel's back. Boris Johnson should have, of course, been hounded out of that. Well, he should never have got into Downing Street in the first place, but the curious conspiracy of Brexit lies, client journalism, and what else would you call it? I don't know, really. Probably just Brexit lies and client journalism. Oh, and his unique ability to call a spade a pineapple. That was what, of course, propelled him into Downing Street. But he should have been roundly removed from there on half a dozen separate occasions, at least two of which we'll touch upon today, because I don't know how closely you're following the COVID inquiry, but it's about as bad as you might have expected. Rishi Sunak was dubbed Dr. Death by his own chief advisor. Do you remember the Eat Out to Help Out? And it almost felt, I'm not trivialising anything that's happening in the Middle East. Pincher, what did I call him? Oh, crikey, I got his name wrong. Why is anyone listening to this nonsense? What was his name? He was called Chris Pincher. What did I just call him? Why is everyone sending me messages to say the word Pincher? I obviously made a mistake. I'm absolutely categorically clear that it was Chris Pincher, not whatever I said. Good Lord, you've got to be so careful. Pincher. All right? God, could someone please pay attention in the production office to what I'm burbling about? I appreciate it's not, the most engaging thing going on in your world today. There's stuff on the telly and you're getting ready for the rugby, but someone's got to listen to this build, otherwise I could get into all sorts of trouble. Thank God it's not a by-election day. I'd have Ofcom all over me. Chris Pincher. All right, stop sending me messages saying Pincher. Oh, I've broken my train of thought now. I'm all discombobulated. I've gone all tatty-filarious. The Johnson issue, the several different occasions on which he should have been roundly removed from Downing Street, but it was the Chris Pincher case that did for him. It's mad, really. Sajid Javid went first. I've got some news about him, I think, for you, possibly later in the show. Rishi Sunak went 9 minutes later. A new biography of Rishi Sunak that I've reviewed for the Times Literary Supplement says that there was absolutely no coordination between Sajid Javid and Rishi Sunak when they decided to resign over Boris Johnson by issuing letters 9 minutes apart. I mean, it's written by the same bloke that made the claims about David Cameron's intimate relations with a pig's head, so you probably have to take it with a large cellar full of salt. But it's just a complete coincidence that they both resigned 9 minutes apart from two of the most senior positions in Boris Johnson's cabinet. But it was Pincher, who did for him. So that's why one of these constituencies was up for grabs yesterday. And the other one, of course, was up for grabs because of the departure from Parliament of, and there is a little bit of competition here from Jacob Rees-Mogg, but the departure from Cabinet of a politician who probably more than any other embodies just how awful everything had got by the time Boris Johnson was putting together his cabinet. The idea that Nadine Dorries, a woman you wouldn't trust to do the washing up without breaking your best crockery, could end up as Secretary of State for Culture, Media and Sport. A vicious, libelous, ignorant liar who was incapable of conducting herself with even a scintilla of decorum, even as she threw her toys out of the pram. She, of course, vowed to resign with immediate effect and subsequently took, was it 2 months or 3 months, to finally quit the field. So do you know who I feel sorry for? And this is going to sound really odd, and I've forgotten his name already, so it's not keeping me awake at night. But I feel sorry for the Conservative candidate who ran in mid-beds yesterday, because this defeat, I don't think, has got a great deal to do with him or a great deal to do with the Labour candidate in particular. I know that the Tamworth result suggests that there were broader issues in play, but I mean, it's so unfair for someone to have to go into bat after Nadine Dorries. As I say, it's not keeping me awake at night. He was the police and crime commissioner in the area, so I presume he's got a job to go back to. It's not one of those situations where you've given up your job and lost a by-election that you should have really romped home in, and now you don't know what you're going to do with yourself. But I felt very sorry for him because he has to kind of clean up her mess, something she's never done herself. I think she had her daughters on the payroll at one point, didn't she, to clean up her mess in the office? But he had to clean up her mess, and I'm not sure any politician has made more mess than Nadine Dorries. From a non-prime ministerial position. So it's coming up to 10:10. It's about as bad as it could have gone for the Tories yesterday. What I've just touched upon is because I wonder how much of it was to do with the awfulness of the candidates that were being replaced and how much of it has to do with the broader sweep of UK party politics. In Tamworth, they overturned a majority of 19,000, more than 19,000 votes. I presume this text was sent before I came on air this morning, Jed. Jed's been in touch to say the funniest thing on the radio this morning is a certain station floundering about for any positives for the Conservatives this morning. I'm not sure. I think there might have been an opinion poll in Wales. But you'd have to be pretty desperate to be clinging to that on a morning like this. But the simple question really is how much of it was down to constituency matters and how much of it is writing on the wall for the Conservative Party. 19,000 in Tamworth, 24,000 in Dorries' former seat, Mid Beds, which has been in Conservative Party hands for 90 years. 90 years. And, I mean, by-elections often throw up historically anomalous results. You can't read too much into them. And both of these seats could easily swing back to the Conservative Party at the next general election, even if Labour secure a fairly considerable majority, such is the calculus, the electoral calculus of the situation. And I'm not sure I have enough people listening in mid beds to confine the question to you. How much of this was down to the awfulness of Nadine Dorries, the unmitigated awfulness of Nadine Dorries? Daily Mail columnist Nadine Dorries, we should say, because remember that conspiracy of client journalism and Brexit lies that I told you about, they look after their own. So you actually get rewarded for being appalling by the owner of the Daily Mail. Boris Johnson now has a column at the Daily Mail. Nadine Dorries now has a column at the Daily Mail. You bring the country to its knees through your dishonesty and incompetence, and the Daily Mail pop up to say, "Oh, have a couple of $100,000 a year to write a column." That's broken Britain for you. That's what they've done to us. Luckily, there's a book out 2 weeks yesterday that details all of this in forensic detail. So I don't know. I don't know how many people I've got listening currently in these constituencies that could tell me how much of it was down to the awfulness of the previous candidates. That's a clear case in Dorries' case. Pinchot, albeit that he left the Commons in disgrace, didn't leave surrounded by a catalogue of incompetence and unpleasantness. There weren't, countless clips and instances of him being both rubbish and nasty. He was a wrong-un in the context of specific behaviour, and that's what went for him. So I don't know if you have a legacy of resentment in a constituency for a case like his. For Dorries, goodness knows. Where does it begin and where does it end, the catalogue of incompetence? So how much of that will have contributed to this remarkable reverse in mid-beds? The bloke in Tamworth who had been revealed to have just 2 or 3 years ago put together a hilarious online cartoon telling people who can't afford to feed their children to F off, which I thought was quite ironic because within about 90 seconds of the result being read out in Tamworth yesterday, He effed off. Andrew Cooper is his name. You've probably forgotten it already, which is about the extent of his contribution to public discourse. So what question am I asking you today? Well, I'm asking you, what do you think is going on? You'll notice there's no celebratory tone in my voice, even though I find the current iteration of the Conservative Party to be almost unbelievably awful for our shared country. But it's not footballification. Keir Starmer's caution is becoming troubling. There are no wins to be had from just cheering according to the colour of your scarf or jumping up and down according to your previous tribal loyalties. The question that I'm asking is very, very broad. I think we've been so immersed in Middle Eastern politics now for 2 weeks that we can allow ourselves a bit of a sweep, a bit of a wider survey of the political landscape. So we will use Mid-Bedfordshire in particular, and Tamworth a little as well, to ask the question, how much of it was hatred for Dorries? How much of this do you think was down to Nadine Dorries being such an unfeasibly awful human being and politician? 0345 6060 973. But, bigger question, what does it say? How bad is it? There you go. I'm going in with this. How bad is it now for the Tories? How bad do you think it is for the Tories? And on days like this, on mornings like this, I do like to hear from traditional Conservative voters. I'm fascinated, and I don't think anyone's really studied this yet, but a sort of a passionate Conservative, a loyal Conservative, a committed small and big C Conservative who recognised, for example, the idiocy of leaving the European Union or the awfulness of Boris Johnson. I think you must be the loneliest people in British politics. Even for Labour supporters who were very unimpressed by Jeremy Corbyn, at least there was still a cabinet full of people you could get behind, even if you struggled to get behind the actual leader. For lifelong Conservatives, dyed-in-the-wool Conservatives, One Nation Conservatives, decent, honest Conservatives, what the hell has happened to you? Not even your party, but what's happened to you? You knew that leaving the European Union was a ridiculous idea. You knew they were lying about it. You knew that when Boris Johnson purged everyone from your parliamentary party who was prepared to tell the truth, that it was going to cause some form of apocalypse at some point further down the line. And you knew that Boris Johnson was so undeserving of the highest office in the land that you couldn't quite believe it had happened, even after it had. It's amazing to reflect upon that. David Cameron, a fairly rubbish Prime Minister, his hubris really being his arrogance and his sense of entitlement and his sort of very blithe belief that he'd be able to steer to victory in the referendum in the same way that he had in the 2015 election without really breaking a sweat or stretching his legs. But I mean, at least he wasn't depraved in a political sense. At least he wasn't capable of calling a spade a pineapple. The sheer scale of the dishonesty ushered in by Boris Johnson was off the absolute charts. So if that's you, good grief, you're thinking to yourself, James is describing me. I can't quite conceive. If you'd asked me in 2015 if I could envision ever voting for any party other than the Conservatives for the rest of my life, I'd have said, no, I just can't. Why would I? Hey, there's good ones and bad ones, but I'd rather blue than red, whatever the day of the week may be. And now the party has moved so far away from you, I think you are probably the loneliest voters in Britain. What's it like? 0345 6060 973. So how much of it was local and how much of it was national? And how bad is it now? How bad is it now for the Tories? And I'm not doing Schadenfreude or celebration today. It doesn't have to be cool-headed, sober analysis. You can allow yourself a little bit of a flutter. But I don't want any hyperbole. Okay, how much of it was local? Nadine Dorries, the contempt she held for her constituents was disgusting, says my texter. And how much of it was national? And how bad is it now for Seven Bin Sunak and the Conservative Party? It's 10:18.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 21 minutes after 10. James is in Northampton. He says, "You're being too kind to Cameron. With Cameron came Osborne and austerity. All of this begins with austerity and therefore Cameron. I know the subsequent leaders have been more of a skip fire, so we forget the fire that Cameron started." I may have given that impression, but it's certainly not my deeper view. Credit to Tom, who clearly doesn't tune in very often. Tom's been in touch to say, "Hi James, what's the name of the book you mentioned?" Well, oddly enough, Tom, the book that I mentioned makes precisely the point that James in Northampton just shared. You cannot unpick the catastrophe that is the current Conservative Party without starting, and indeed you cannot unpick the diminishment of the United Kingdom without starting, at least in part, with David Cameron and austerity. The book is called How They Broke Britain, Tom, and it's published on November the 2nd by, what's his name? That really annoying bloke on the radio. You know, the one who thinks he's right about everything, and usually is. What's his name? James O'Brien, that's the fella. Alex is in Clifton. Alex, that's in Bedfordshire. What would you like to say?
It is. Good morning, James. Pleasure to speak to you.
Likewise.
Look, I would say there are three reasons why my wife and I voted Labour for the first time yesterday. Because we are, exactly as you described,
Yes.
Tory voters regularly, have been probably ever since I voted Lib Dem when I was a soon-to-be student at 18, when they promised to
Gosh,
not put any...
God, you're all sorts of case studies, aren't you?
Indeed. And yeah, I'd say there's three reasons. I think 33% of why, and it is only 33%,
Yes.
is because of Doris.
Right.
I mean, she was AWOL.
Yeah.
Having lived here for 5 years, almost everything you say about Doris, despite it sounding extreme for anyone that lives outside of the area, is true.
Right.
She was never here. There was never a constituent meeting to be had on a Friday. You know, all of that stuff was just, it was an abdication of duty. It was. So the Tories definitely weren't going to get my vote or my wife's vote this time around. So then, well, who do you vote for? And I think 66% of the reason was probably for two parts. The first thing to say is both the Lib Dems and Labour tried really hard in this area. They were round every day, putting something through the door or knocking on the door. And I'm on paternity leave at the moment. Okay. So I've spoken to lots of them. And, you know, what I would say, first of all, is, you know, from a Labour perspective, the campaigners asked what's important to us. I gave them a couple of really simple local things, and they wrote back within a week, and Alistair said, he's the guy who's just been elected.
Wow.
You know, if I win your vote, if I am elected, I will do something about these 2 points. And I thought, well, that's brilliant, because there is a need for action. There is a need for.
So
us
they
to
were
get
they were
back to
chasing
basics
every
and
vote,
politics.
almost on a micro level, chasing every single vote.
Absolutely right.
Interesting.
No matter where you live, no matter where you are, no matter if your neighbour's got a Lib Dem sign up or whatever, they were round every day. Different face every day, same red clipboard. And I would say, look, the last thing is just the bigger picture. And like I say, I think 66% of the reason why I voted Labour is because of, you know, How They Broke Britain is an apt title for your book. Having voted Tory all my life, except for that one time Lib Dem, you know, I tore my Achilles tendon last summer.
I'm sorry
and when
to hear
I did that, I was in agony.
Sure.
Nothing quite like childbirth for my wife last week, but agony. And
It's a very good job you slipped that in. Well done.
Early next door.
No, quite right. I mean, what are we talking? 66% as bad, was it?
Maybe she was 52, I was 48.
Yeah, God forbid. So you got to A&E.
I got to A&E and I waited there 14 hours, and there weren't enough seats in A&E for Jen and I. I had my foot on a hazardous waste bin just to keep it up. Wasn't offered any painkillers, any else. You know, just this need for us to get back to basics. Yes. And, you know, nobody in the NHS is deliberately doing a bad job. But the state of the country and where we've got to means that they just cannot do a basic job well. And so we need change, and that's where I've got to.
And that is, that is a brilliant analysis, actually. Just briefly, and this is not important in the great scheme of things at the moment for the conversation that we're having, but can you see, just as specific to your constituency and I suppose your vote, will it swing back? Because if it's 66% circumstance and 33% local, then it could swing back at the general election to the you know, the Tory voters who either stayed at home yesterday or can't quite believe that they voted Labour.
I would suggest in this constituency that won't happen.
Okay.
Because if I was in Alistair's shoes, all I need to do is a few local basics, show that I'm actually going to do some action for local constituents, and he will naturally do a better job than Dorries.
Yes.
So he's got a year to do
That's a really interesting point, isn't it? Is that he gets at every turn to put clear blue water between him and the Conservative legacy, or clear red water, if you prefer. I like that a lot. So actually, just even with my rudimentary mathematics, that's 99% of your vote that you've explained, Alex.
Yeah, perhaps.
There's 1% missing.
Go on.
I don't know what it was. So you just said it's 33% how awful Dorries was and 66% a combination. So let's leave a little bit of mystery. Everybody leaves a little bit of mystery. Thank you. Can we make sure we clip up the bit where Alex said that How They Broke Britain is a very apt name for a book in the current political climate? I thought that was an astonishingly insightful contribution to the programme. And good luck with it. Oh, actually, Alex, before you go, are you still there? You know that paternity leave.
See you next Tuesday as well.
You know that paternity leave that you're currently enjoying?
Oh, yeah. 2003,
wasn't it? Labour.
Yes.
Just a thought. Just leaving it there. Just hanging it out there. Ben's in Tamworth. Ben, what would you like to say?
Good morning, James. Thank you very much for having me back on the big show.
That's great, isn't it? We go from Mid-Beds to Tamworth. It's almost as if we've got our finger on several pulses at the same time. Ben, what would you like to say?
Well, it's a glorious morning in Tamworth because this by-election has been a long time coming. Ever since the whole fiasco with Chris Pincher happened, we have been begging for a by-election, and it just sort of kept getting swept under the rug. There was always more, more... I can't think of the word, sorry, mate. But there was always some other story that the media wanted to cover, say Nadine Dorries had done something stupid or something like that. So Chris Pincher's, the by-election in Tamworth never really got as much media attention.
No.
So we've been crying out for this, and then when it's actually happened, the candidate that the Tory party have put up has been, in my opinion, indicative of the macro culture of the Tory party in the country.
That's
at the moment.
Beautifully put, actually. Better put than I would have managed, because I described him as precisely the sort of character that is attracted to the current iteration of the Tory party.
Yes.
The kind of bloke who goes on Facebook sharing memes abusing poor people. That's the kind of bloke who looks at Rishi Sunak's party and Lee what's his name's part 30p Lee's party and thinks that's the place for me. Whereas our last caller, a lifelong Tory, looks at it and goes, "What the hell has happened here?"
But not just that. He went and that Facebook post or whatever it was got exposed.
Yes.
And then the proverbial excrement hit the fan, and it was all over his Facebook. Lots of Tamworth constituents going onto his Facebook post to say, "What's this all about?"
Oh, yeah.
He ended up doubling down on it. And then having to remove his entire Facebook page because of the backlash.
Is that right?
He was blaming it on, this is typically of the left and this is that. And in 2020, when I first posted this, it was a whole age ago. Times were different back then. And then he went on Channel 5 and actually reiterated that. Didn't show any contrition, empathy for people who might have hungry kids, and doubled down on it. And it was just so typically Tory, typically Johnson, typically Patel or Braverman.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? So we've got this, as I said to the person who originally took my call when I called in, there's this macro landscape in the country that already, people are angry and want to get the Tories out, and that they'll vote tactically. Don't care who it is.
And that is when you say macro, essentially you mean national. That is so regardless of the particular unpleasantnesses attached to the incumbent MPs in both, or the departed MPs in both constituencies, we so far it would seem people are very much cautioning against seeing these as flashes in pans, and instead suggesting that they're deeply indicative of the bigger picture. Thank you, Ben. Another one actually from a bit further north. You've got this spot on. As a door-knocking Conservative member in previous elections in Scotland, I find myself thinking Starmer is the best bet for the country, although my vote is likely to go to whichever of Labour or the Conservatives is most likely to beat the SNP. I'm just reading out the text. That's not in any way indicative of anything other than the opinion of the person who sent that text. There could be another one soon as well, couldn't there? Peter Bone, his constituency could be up for a by-election soon, and it would feel exactly like these two, wouldn't it? Someone... anyway, Thomas Watts is here now with the headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
25 minutes to 11. John in Exeter wonders whether we're missing the bigger picture here. Is it possible, he writes, that Nadine Dorries has actually played a blinder because Keir Starmer might put her in the House of Lords now? It's just, yeah, stop it. And going back to mid-Bedfordshire, I agree with Alex. Dorries was absent in the 7 years, writes Laura in Barton, that I've lived in mid-Beds. The Labour and Lib Dems nailed the doorstep engagement, listened to constituents. My first sight of a Tory yesterday was at a polling station, and I gave them short shrift for their complete lack of engagement. It's likely they felt they were entitled to win this seat. If Alistair simply engages with us and focuses on our issues, he will be a massive positive for mid-Beds. He's done something right, I would suggest, in the way that the three constituents we've heard from so far, and Alex very much describing himself as a lifelong Tory, are all referring to him by his first name. That speaks of an incredibly strong ground game, which I'm told the Liberal Democrats also undertook. But anyway, I do feel sympathy for what you might call the I do feel sympathy for Conservatives, traditional Conservatives, alienated by what you would have to call the post-Brexit Tory party, the party of Lee Anderson and this bloke sharing Facebook memes about hungry children should F off, or their parents should. That horrible sort of atavistic, if that's the right word, incarnation. That's what it's become. Suella Braverman competing to be even more disgusting about refugees than Priti Patel was. It's pretty horrible. And of course, as our callers have reminded us, what people want is meaningful improvement. And what Rishi Sunak gives them is the abolition of a meat tax that doesn't exist, and a promise to end the war on 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 motorists. Miriam's in Ampthill, Hill, also in Bedfordshire. Miriam, what would you like to say?
Hi. Yes, Ampthill, Hill, lovely little market town. The last place on earth you would expect to not vote Tory.
Yes.
So we voted, but my husband and I, we both Labour. The main driver was get the Tories out, for sure.
Okay.
Because everything's been said about Nadine Dorries. It's just too boring to go over. She's
I completely disagree. I don't think I will I will ever get bored of because once the seal breaks, the flood begins. Miriam,
it's my blood pressure.
Well, I don't want to affect your blood pressure, but for me, the reason I never get bored of it, she's an almost perfect representation of everything awful that has happened. You know, she's a Johnson sycophant. She's a vicious activist. She lies. She libels Britain's most popular radio presenter. But we will move on because I'm worried about your blood pressure.
My blood pressure.
Yes.
So yes, she is agreed. So my calculation was, okay, which of the two remaining parties is the more likely to get in? Failing being able to predict that, which of course is impossible, I then thought, well, I might as well go with the party that I actually genuinely support in terms of its policies and so on. So we voted Labour. Oh. But and this morning I was hoping that I would be able to do this. I'm leaving our Support Labour poster in our window because I'm just so chuffed and pleased.
Oh, that's interesting.
I'm going to leave it up because I where we live really is not the sort of place you would expect to vote Labour at all. And even talking about politics it's sort of seen as rather bad form. It's sort of not good manners to talk about things like that. So for us to turn Labour is great. And Alistair has been brilliant.
There it is again. His first name terms. It's really remarkable. Good.
I went out for lunch with my friend Dan yesterday, and just as we went into the restaurant, there he was, walking around, talking to people. So we sort of buttonholed him and said, hope you win. But the Labour Party did a brilliant job, as did the Lib Dems, with one caveat.
Go on.
They made a mistake. They actually told... Well, how can I put it in a politic way? They were not entirely open about how they had characterised the Labour candidate.
Okay.
They said that he didn't live in the area, and he does. And,
so sorts of dirty tricks a bit.
Yeah, a little bit. And that was really disappointing. Although, having said that, Ed Davey came around and he campaigned himself in the constituency, and he was really, really nice chap.
So you've gone from being pariahs, politically speaking, utterly ignored, forgotten
Totally.
and abandoned by Westminster, to being...
And now they're all over
We've
us.
got suitors queuing around the block. Your dance card could not be fuller, Miriam, could it?
Indeed it couldn't, James, and long may that last.
Well, and I love the way you speak about the successful candidate, and you're not, as I mentioned just before you came on, you're not the first, but he has got his work cut out, of course, because this was an enormous swing, an enormous turnaround. But I wonder if it is too early to wonder if to suggest that the post-Brexit realignment is underway and it will render some of those tribal loyalties almost, or historic loyalties to be fairer, they will become increasingly looser. And so the idea, particularly perhaps in the southeast or the Midlands, but the idea of a absolutely super safe Tory seat is beginning to disappear in the way that the combination of Boris Johnson's lies and Brexit nonsense meant that super safe Labour seats ceased to be a thing at the 2019 election. I don't know. That's one for the analysts. Thank you, Miriam. Rory's in Flitwick, also in Bedfordshire, of course. Rory, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
First-time caller.
Welcome.
So you go a little bit easy on me. But I think actually I was in the same area as Miriam at the time, because I found Alistair in the car park near the middle of Adshall yesterday, and he had a mouthful of squares. You know those crisps?
Big salt and vinegar.
Yeah, they were. But it's the most human I've ever seen a politician in my life.
That's so interesting.
I'm very much along the same lines as her, really. There was a big question for tactical voting here, whether there were enough Conservative voters willing to vote for Labour compared to the Lib Dems.
Yes.
Because obviously we have a lot in common with places like Somerset and Frome, which went to the Lib Dems, and each side was really putting forward their case of why they were available or able to win. But really, I come from a household of a number of different kinds of voters. But it was really after my mum flipped from Conservative to Labour this time around that kind of made me go, I think I'm going to check my box for Labour over the Lib Dems.
This is a big deal, isn't it, Rory? So I don't think I've conducted a post-by-election phone-in quite like this. Certainly not where everybody who's flipped votes is talking about the person they flipped to as if they were sort of an old mate that they were eating crisps with in the car park yesterday. Can I ask, can I just ask about your mum and why you were so surprised that she flipped, and how big a part, what I called earlier, I described it as Keir Starmer's caution, but Mike in Sutton has been in touch. He says, you mentioned Starmer's caution, James, but the opposite of caution isn't always boldness. Sometimes it's carelessness. Do you think your mum is one of those voters to whom Keir Starmer's very, very careful approach has made a difference?
I think that certainly might be part of it. I think part of it is also definitely a protest vote against Nadine Dorries.
So that could swing back then.
Talking a lot more about that.
That could swing back in a year.
But maybe. We'll have to see. But no, she was actually quite happy that Alistair won. So it's clearly not just a protest vote in the sense of, the Labour candidate won now. Yeah, okay, thank goodness Dorries is out. But she was genuinely happy this morning.
That's really
it was a really powerful moment, because both of my parents have been Conservative voters for basically as long as they've lived, both born in the 60s. A lot of their political awakening was to do with the strikes in the 70s. Yeah. As you can tell, I'm quite young. I never saw any of that. But it meant that, after Thatcher, it was Conservative all the way for the rest of their lives. But
that's really interesting.
Got
so something has moved. And I like the personal touch that is coming through, like loud and clear on the call this morning. But of course, for the candidate to triumph, the ground had to have already been prepared. Even if he was a brilliant candidate, the willingness to wobble, the winnability of the votes of people like your parents was established not by the candidate, but by the broader political landscape. This is absolutely fascinating. And I know I've just done it. I think that is... It's not Flitwick, it's Flitwick. And we've been here before, haven't we? I've made that mistake before. So now my inbox is basically full of people saying... Pincher, and it's Flitwick, not Flitwick. What a time to be alive.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 10:48 and you're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Let's have a few texts because they're quite they're always interesting. How bad is it for the Conservatives, you ask? I am a lifelong Conservative and I wouldn't vote for them. That's unsigned. Tracy says it's about how awful and incompetent Festus is. That's the defeated Conservative candidate in Mid-Beds, and how awful Nadine is. But we don't want Labour. Next time they will have a better Tory candidate and they will win. I am in Leighton Buzzard, which is nearby. Danny is in Amt Hill, which is the village from which Miriam called in a state of high delight and surprise at the turnaround here. And he says, I'd say a large chunk of this is due to Dorries. The delayed departure only made it worse and allowed Labour to get organised and campaign hard. But Alistair Strathern was a superb candidate and worked his, I shall say backside, if that's all right with you, worked his backside off throughout the campaign. He's already been more visible than Dorries ever was. That's an astonishing kind of, what's the word I want? A summary of Nadine Dorries as MP. A bloke who's not been an MP for 24 hours yet is described by a constituent as having already achieved more visibility than she achieved in, I forget how many years. And anyone tuning into the programme relatively early, you should know we were very, very early adopters of understanding exactly what Nadine Dorries was about. Very, very early adopters. So the slow dawning for the people of Mid-Bedfordshire is a little bittersweet because of the damage that these people have done as a consequence of all of the things that I bang on about every morning. Let's move a little further north. Daniel's in Doncaster. Daniel, what would you like to say?
Hello, James.
Hello.
Good morning. Thank you for having me on. A wonderful show that you do. Please don't ever stop doing it. It's a very important show.
Thank you.
And,
lovely thing to say. Thank you.
And it's a pleasure to follow some of your other callers this morning. I don't know if I can really add a great deal of insight because they've already made a lot of the points I was going to.
Well, you're outside the constituency, so it'll be interesting to hear the sort of broader view.
This is true, yes. I'm in very much in a red wall seat these days. I used to live in Sheffield Hallam, Nick Clegg's old seat, and before that I lived in Nottingham for a long time. And really, I woke up to this news this morning and I just feel really happy. Like I wouldn't say it's Schadenfreude, but I do think the people in these constituencies are showing us the way because there is no such thing as a safe Tory seat anymore. And, it really shows if people really want a change, if you go out and vote for it, and if enough people do it, it will happen. And I say that as an ex-Conservative, not as a voter, but volunteer, campaigner, canvasser. I used to, pre-2015, I did quite a bit of volunteering for them, actually.
Yes.
And I remember how happy I was when they won the 2015 election outright.
Yes.
And I remember what David Cameron said that day, which is you're going to see something special now with a Conservative majority government.
Yeah.
And well, if that's his definition of special, then I hate to see his definition of, unpleasant.
What was it? So you voted to avoid chaos with Ed Miliband.
Well, this is it. And, I hope I'm one of those people that you can forgive for being
No, it's nothing to do with forgiveness.
Rather than a liar.
No.
But you know what I mean.
Of course I do.
And,
of course I do.
What
broke then? What do you think?
I think the straw that broke the camel's back for me was Brexit. As soon as that unfolded the way it did,
yes,
and the position the party adopted was just a total break with what it had done for the previous 40 years, basically, of foreign policy. And I think I knew then that it was very hard for me to vote for a party that was actively trying to get us out of the EU. Even though it was post-referendum, there was obviously a lot of issues about referendum, which we won't bother going into now.
Of course, but there was no reason to go as extreme or as radical as they chose to. They went
very extreme. And what has happened since then is, the Conservative Party is no longer one that I recognise. I would certainly in the past have described myself as a one-nation Tory, somebody who, believed in making society a better place, believed in equalising opportunity and giving people personal responsibility, all that type of stuff, and crucially respecting people from whatever background they come from. Yeah. And that is not the party that is in power now.
No,
and
clearly not.
It is an extremely unsettling agenda that has got control of the Tory party, sadly.
I was reading about the tribulations that the Republican Party is having in America at the moment, and it was really described essentially as a party in the traditional sense of the word, only in name. now. The difference here is that, I mean, if there are people in the parliamentary party who are much closer to you than they are to Suella Braverman, for example, or 30p Lee, or even Rishi Sunak, then they are very, very, very quiet. So I don't know.
Yeah, and that's what's sorry to interrupt you, James. That's what's disappointing, really, isn't it? Is that
I think so.
I know there are people in the party who do feel like I do, but I don't see them doing anything to stop what is happening. And so, therefore, I'm in a position where I cannot possibly vote Conservative. I used to think, back when I worked for them, that I'd never vote for anybody else other than the Conservatives, and now I can't imagine how I could ever vote for the Conservatives again.
Absolutely incredible.
And I I would say I'm quite a moderate person.
Sure.
I'm not particularly ideological, although actually I think, to be fair, I think since Brexit I have moved a bit more leftwards, to be honest.
Okay.
But I'm obviously not sorry about that.
Well, Brexit doesn't have to be perceived as a left-wing project. That's another part of the problem that's been sort of perpetuated over the last few years. Is that's entirely how it was typified, but it doesn't need to be viewed like that. Free trade, for example.
All the stuff that they are doing along with it.
Yes.
The type of... I mean, I find it really rich of Farage to say Brexit failed because it hasn't been done how he thought it should be.
Yeah.
To be fair, I think what has happened is pretty damn close to exactly what he would have done if he'd been in charge.
Of course it is.
And, all the positions they've adopted on, obviously, social matters, immigration, what they've done to public services, it's just unforgivable. And to be honest, I'm actually at a stage now where I think that...
Go on.
I'm fearful that if Labour wins next time, I just very much hope it's not just for one term, because what will happen to the Tory party in opposition, people like Liz Truss will get very much back front and centre again. They'll move further to the right, and they'll present, I guess it'll be, what will it be, 2029? They'll present an agenda that is even more disturbing. And so I do hope the Labour have a good buffer to defend with, because the Tories will attack very hard with that agenda.
That's really interesting. You're a deep thinker. I don't mean that in a silly way. Obviously, because you've got a lot of personal investment in the ebb and flow of British politics, because you've been caught on the tide so much. What about this idea that the traditional analyses are becoming redundant? We got a sniff of it with the red wall seats and the fact that they were so eminently flippable. But I mean, I'm talking about a party that is conservative in the traditional sense, that the only thing that unites these people is the rosette. It's the party. A one nation Tory like you has next to nothing in common with somebody like Braverman. Yeah. How feasible do you think it is that the whole nature of politics is in flux, that we're in one of those bizarre periods of complete recalibration?
I do think there's a lot in that. I mean, it's interesting. In 2019, when the Red Wall collapsed and obviously Boris Johnson won that election and so on, I think a lot of us thought that process was completed. Or certainly I think the Conservatives might have thought that. I hasten to add, I did not vote for the Conservatives at that time, and I'm very pleased that I didn't. But I think what is happening is that process, you're right, that process is not over. There is still a recalibration going on. There's still a lot of latent anger following what happened with Brexit, not just the way the referendum went, but what's happened to society since under this government. People are angry about that. That's not the Britain they want this country to be. And
the people who aren't angry about it, or rather the people who are angry but for the precisely opposite reasons, are the only people to whom the Conservative Party seem to be speaking at the moment.
Yeah, and of course that's not enough to win a majority. The likes of us have is that's not enough.
Unless you get a kind of, like we did in 2010, you could argue, unless you get one of those sort of congregations of circumstance that feed far-right sentiment, I mean, throughout history. 2010 is not a good example, but you've got an immigration crisis, you've got an economic crisis, you've got a cost of living crisis, and the right demagogue steps into that space and tries to blame it all on your neighbours. History has taught us that can be effective, but it's crucial to recognise that you need the right demagogue. But hopefully we won't have those scenarios in place when the second term election comes around, presuming he wins a first term. Thank you, Daniel. I found that incredibly insightful, as indeed is this text from Ian. Lifelong Tory here. I'm disgusted by the current party. I did have some hope with Sunak, but like you, the moment he put Braverman back in the cabinet, that hope went out the window. My problem is that I have 2 children in private schools, and VAT will mean that I can't possibly afford for them to stay. And I'm not alone in this situation. I desperately want change, but I'm conscious that change will have a fundamental effect on mine and many other children's lives. I'd rather Labour banned the private sector altogether rather than make it more elite. And Ian signs off with small violin playing in Hampshire. I mean, that is what Starmer's done, isn't it? He has decided that he is... Well, we all criticise him for excess caution and talk about him carrying a Ming vase across an ice rink. He has actually identified potential Labour voters who he's going to hit hard enough to make them reconsider their vote, certainly. And he said something very bold earlier this week on another radio station when he was asked whether he is just going to turn around to some people who are objecting to the prospect of new houses being built in their patch and tell them, tough, we're going to have to build them. And Starmer said, yeah, that's exactly what I'm going to do. So, you know, if he segues now from caution in a good way to clear but not universally popular policies, the Tories, if they think they've got problems now, they've got a whole heap of new problems coming. Thank you for that. Great, amazing calls. It was Paige, I think, who said I was being unduly pessimistic when I said there's no way you can do a phone-in confined only to people from a constituency that voted yesterday, but that was close to perfect in terms of contributions. Fat slices from Mid-Beds, a couple of tickles from Tamworth, and then an overview from South Yorkshire, which all pointed to a similar conclusion, and that is that the constituency, the specific constituency issues that were in play yesterday were not significant enough to have skewed the national picture. And remember, this these by-elections, they fit with a pattern of national polling that's been in place for a good year now.
James O'Brien on LBC.
3 minutes after 11 is the time. We turn our attention now to a question I would rather not ask. And the question is this: do you think they're going to get away with it? I don't know enough to opine on what proper justice would look like. I don't know what penalties are in play. It is perhaps a mark of how poorly reported the whole thing is being that I, as someone with a deep and abiding interest in the issue, can't tell you for certain what sanction the COVID inquiry, because it is that of which we speak, what sanction the COVID inquiry has, what punishment it can mete out to people found to have behaved badly. But I do know this: the inquiry is unearthing some astonishing testimony, up to and including the Daily Mail putting pressure upon Boris Johnson to lift lockdowns because it was affecting newspaper sales, reportedly. Now, think about that for a moment. It's mad, isn't it, how the current political climate is almost working retrospectively to prove every single thing we've been talking about on this programme for the best part of 7 years. The last hour was a sort of hinge point would have been the utter awfulness of Nadine Dorries, and now we're looking at the utter awfulness of the Daily Mail, putting pressure on the utterly awful Boris Johnson to lift the awfully late lockdowns because it was affecting newspaper sales. But that's the problem, you see, because so much of the media was complicit in the mess in Downing Street. I don't know whether enough people are going to find out about what the COVID inquiry is unearthing. The Daily Mail is not going to publish a fulminating front page about how awful it is that the Daily Mail sought to influence public health and possibly increase death rates in order to sell more newspapers, are they? They're just not going to do that. So who is going to tell you? Where is the information going to come from? That's the question. I suspect that if I'd lost somebody to COVID during the pandemic, the dog days of the pandemic, of course, I suspect I'd be following things even more closely than I am. And I feel a responsibility to do so on your behalf, while also somewhat shamefacedly reflecting the bigger picture, which is that the it's getting the attention in the places that you'd expect, to which I'm going to add this programme now. So I want you to hear in exchange, the two people I think you hear speaking in this clip are John Edmonds, a professor of infectious disease modelling, and Hugo Keith, King's Counsel, the COVID Inquiries Council, and they refer, amongst other things, to a comment made by Dame Angela McLean, now the government's chief scientific advisor, in which she called Rishi Sunak Dr. Death, the Chancellor, because anybody medically qualified would have known that his Eat Out to Help Out scheme was horrible. Do you remember the tightrope we walked at the time? And I just found, because we all wanted it so badly, didn't we? Do you remember? It was as if, well, look, he's the Chancellor of the Exchequer. You don't have to be a cap-doffing, forelock-tugging fool to think, well, if he thinks it's okay, I mean, he's getting all the information. He's in the room where it happens. The room where it happens. He's not Boris Johnson. He's not a massive opportunist who spent his whole life lying. Rishi Sunak says we can all go out for a meal and it's going to be cheap because he's subsidising the cut. Do you remember? I can feel my dander rising on this one. I think it had a lot to do with him. It was before we knew that much about him. He just seemed like quite a nice, shiny little fella, didn't he? And he'd done the furlough, which was, I know that there were 2 million people completely abandoned by it, many of whom have never recovered really, either emotionally or economically. But it was still more good than bad in an objective sense. So he'd done the furlough. We like the look of that. And then he came along with Eat Out to Help Out, and we all trusted him. I remember tweeting something about, hang on, lads. I'm pretty sure that the reason why this death rate's just spiked, or infection rate has just spiked, is because we were all down at Wagamama's last week having a chicken chili ramen. I only use Wagamama's because that, I think, is the restaurant that Rishi Sunak chose to pretend to be a waiter in. I'm not buffing my middle-class credentials in public again. So, and I tweeted something, and I got attacked by a bloke who ran a steak house. I ended up writing about it in the Daily Telegraph. Little old me, simply saying it seems pretty clear that inviting everybody out to eat together is a large part of the reason why a week later the infection rates started rocketing again. But don't take my word for it. Dame Angela McLean called him Dr. Death. So that is one of the bits about the inquiry that's underway. I'm going to play you quite a bit, actually. I'm going to play you 2 clips, totaling 6 or 7 minutes, because, and I say this very cautiously, I think they're going to get away with it. I think, you look at Hillsborough and Grenfell still unfolding. This country does not have a proud history of delivering justice to people who died unnecessarily. It really doesn't. Do you remember the bloke who got released from jail because he'd been wrongly convicted of rape, and he'd been there for decades? I think his name is Andrew. Is it Malkinson? He's just come out. He's currently living in a tent in Spain, and part of the reason he gave is that he doesn't have any trust in the British establishment to bring him justice. And part of his rationale for that is, he cited Hillsborough himself. It's incredible, isn't it? Here he is, a man who spent 17 years in jail for a rape he didn't commit, has said he's broke and living in a tent. He was declared innocent in July after serving 17 years. He's expecting compensation, but is currently living on benefits. Flipping heck. And he is deeply cynical about the prospect of achieving justice. He could have been released after 6.5 years if he'd given a false confession. Wow. That's something he was never willing to do. Oh, boy. That's incredible, isn't it? But it is the anonymity and nature that living in a tent allows him to enjoy. And he says, I cannot bear to be in Britain. The horror will always be with me. And that's the quote there. It is, I don't trust the British. Hillsborough, Bloody Sunday, they can't face the truth. And I think it's possible that COVID might be filed in that dismal catalogue alongside Hillsborough, Bloody Sunday. Grenfell's still unfolding, but I know a lot of the families bereaved by Grenfell are not overflowing with optimism. They certainly haven't given up hope yet. But knowing what you know, seeing what you see, how likely do you think it is that the people responsible for appalling decisions in the early days of COVID will ever face any form of justice or sanction? Anyway, have a little listen to a couple of clips from yesterday's proceedings.
You asked me earlier this morning about being, why didn't we raise the alarm in February or whatever, and I wanted to make sure that didn't happen again. And of course, our surveillance, as you just described, was so much better, so we did know what was happening. I think, so we had all the information, we knew how to do it. That was what that report on the 21st was all about. So we could have avoided much of the autumn wave. We wouldn't have avoided everything, but we could have reduced the incidence. And if we'd have then put the longer term measures in place, we could have kept it low. Over the autumn, cases would have happened. Some people would, unfortunately, have been hospitalised and died. It would have happened. But as it was, we let it go. And, and so when we did eventually, as I'd explained on the 20th with the Prime Minister, I said the decision isn't to lock down or not. The decision is either you do it now and get on top of this epidemic and control the epidemic, or you let it control you. And it will force you into a lockdown at a later date when you'll have to lock down harder and longer, and many people will die as a consequence. And unfortunately, that is what happened. Over that autumn, from around 20 to 25,000 people died. And there is, some would have done, but there is no reason for that number of people to have died at all. And then we entered the winter phase with our hospitals full, NHS staff having been under stress for months, as opposed to having. It could have, they could have been doing routine stuff that autumn and clearing the backlog and that was not the case. And then we got hit by the alpha wave, and so on top of all of this pressure, we then had this new virus that was, it took a little while, a couple of weeks to work out, but it was significantly more transmissible. Even worse, though we didn't know this until January, it was also more pathogenic. So we couldn't have been worse prepared, really.
Why did the lockdown from the beginning of November to the beginning of December not bring the levels of incidence, the overall rate, down enough to stop the re-emergence of the greatest part of that second wave, in fact the peak in January?
So it wasn't as stringent as the original lockdown. The key reason that the schools were open, and I think everybody wanted the schools to be open, but there were other things. So there had been slight adjustments in who would be key workers and things like that.
Was it long enough?
Well, if it had been done earlier on, if it had been done in September, it would have been plenty long enough. Or we could have done it around half term, so you'd have had the combination of the schools being closed. As it was, it happened just after half term. It was really made no. It showed there was no real strategy, no long-term thinking. Instead of just bouncing into a panic decision, as opposed to taking a strategic view of it and getting a grip of the epidemic and doing what was necessary when it was necessary.
Is that why, on account of all the things that you say were not done that should have been done, and because the consequence is so terrible that you describe in your statement that second wave was, for you, the worst moment of the epidemic?
I said it publicly at the time. I really did think it was truly awful, and of course it was. another 65,000 people died over the next few months.
I mean, it's impossible to exaggerate what you just heard. A significant portion of 25,000 people who died would perhaps still be alive, according to this professor of infectious disease modelling, if the government had followed the advice they were receiving from people like him. And then when the next wave came along, after lockdowns had been loosened and lightened, albeit that they were already late, another 65,000 people died. Do you know what? I'm beginning to understand why Tory-supporting, very, very wealthy Tory-supporting billionaires have started setting up more media organisations to peddle conspiracies and lies about COVID. I never really got it. I thought, well, this is nuts. They're hemorrhaging money. They've got no viewers. They've got no listeners. And they're peddling conspiracy theories live on air. But, you know, in a normal country, this would kill off the Conservatives forever. Forget the by-elections. What you're learning about here is Rishi Sunak being called Dr. Death by the government's chief scientific advisor, because everybody who understood anything knew that sending us all out to Harry Ramsden's with a voucher in our pocket was going to see an explosion in COVID rates, some of whom would then die. And not locking down when they were told to lock down, because they were... Remember when he went on the telly and talked about letting it run through the population like a dose of flu? Absolutely breathtaking. But I don't know what the... I don't know if this works as a question. Do you think they're going to get away with it? I'll have a think, and we'll listen to a little bit more after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
21 minutes after 11. I mean, what can we do? It's another question worth asking. So here's a story that doesn't come with any audio. Listen, 21 minutes after 11 is the time. I'm off next week, so my energy levels are quite bouncy, I suppose. I'm not demob happy, but I don't feel quite as beleaguered by the news and the tragedy unfolding in the Middle East as I have. Well, of course I still do, but we're talking about other things, so I can break the rules a bit, is what I'm saying. So I don't have a phone-in topic for you at the moment. I just have some reports, and I don't feel particular pressure. There it is. That's what I was looking to say. I'm not feeling the pressure of the work as much as I have done for the last 2 weeks, because I'm halfway through my last show for another week. And so I don't mind if there's no phone in here. I can talk to you about this because somebody has to. And I don't need you to join in, but I would like you to. I just can't think of a question to ask you. I'm sorry. I don't know what the question is. Do you think they'll get away with it? Makes me sound like something out of Scooby-Doo, doesn't it? It's just those pesky kids. But it's really important that we keep talking about this, because everywhere I turn, there's another story. So Boris Johnson's top media official said the Daily Mail's eagerness to get people working in offices during the first COVID lockdown came from being, quotes, desperate, end quotes, to sell newspapers, according to documents released to the official inquiry. And guess what Boris Johnson's top media official's job was before he became Boris Johnson's top media official? Go on, have a guess. He was the political editor of the Daily Mail. He's the bloke that wrote the Enemies of the People front page. His name's James Slack. Guess what his job is now? Go on, have a guess. Deputy editor of Rupert Murdoch's Sun. Oh, and guess whose leaving do it was at Downing Street, where carousing and partying reached previously unscaled heights of awfulness and illegality. Go on, have a guess. I'll give you a clue. He used to be Boris Johnson's top media official, and before that he was political editor of the Daily Mail. Any thoughts? All right, I'll give you another clue. He's currently deputy editor of The Sun. Yeah, James Slack. So he said that a Mail headline in April 2020 predicting that masks could allow people to return to work was spurred by a desire to revive its circulation figures. God, don't you find these disgusting lefty anti-Daily Mail people just unbearable, like the former political editor of the Daily Mail? Comment was part of a series of WhatsApp messages that have been exchanged. Do you even know, because I don't, whether Sunak ever handed his over? Do you know? Remember, Johnson and Sunak were supposed to hand over their WhatsApp messages? I think Boris Johnson claimed that a big boy stole it and ran away, didn't he? Did Rishi Sunak ever hand over his WhatsApp messages? We got hold of Matt Hancock's, but only because he gave them to a journalist so that she could stick him in a book. Matt Hancock's WhatsApp messages in capital letters. We do not have enough masks to say these things. They picked up on a Daily Telegraph headline that said no end in sight for lockdown. And Slack wrote, have a look at the Telegraph front page. They're financially desperate and it's making them write desperate things. They're so worried about newspaper sales that they were urging the government to compromise its already inadequate and belated response to the public health crisis. And Hancock, for once, doesn't emerge from this too badly because he points out we've got to stop this. We don't have enough masks. Talking about this before we are ready risks taking masks from nurses and social care workers who really need them. It is self-indulgent and dangerous, and I'm ramping up purchasing as fast as we can. So if there were still any... I think it might have been James Slack's party. Well, never mind. There were parties to the left of me, parties to the right of me. I think that we now can solve the mystery of why some people kept banging on about working from home being so awful. I suppose you need to work out how adjacent those people are to the interests of newspaper owners. So if they've spent much of their life in the pocket of the Barclay brothers or Rupert Murdoch or Viscount Rothermere, then they would have been popping up on your telly and bending your ear about how awful it was that people were working from home because they were more worried about newspaper sales than they were about your nan's life. And it's coming out in dribs and drabs. I'll give you the phone number, but I haven't got a question. 0345 6060 973. Except perhaps this. You are following it bloody closely. So you can tell the rest of us what's going on. Because I've got this really grim sense that this is almost happening in a vacuum. Apart from The Guardian, I'm not sure, and the BBC will be doing their best, but the BBC's under constant bombardment from the actual government, as well as the newspapers responsible for... So the BBC's cowed, you see. Why do they keep attacking the BBC? Well, so that the BBC doesn't report things like this in as much depth and detail as it should do. I hope I'm proved wrong about that, and I hope I'm proved wrong soon. But there it is. And there's more. So you remember this strange bloke, Carl Hennigan, who kept getting cited by people who were desperate to claim that we didn't need any lockdowns. Do you remember that? You popped up quite a lot. Used to see it in Idiot's Corner. Used to get cited. You know, you'd think, well, you know, you found one. What was his title? You found one scientist, a professor of evidence-based medicine at Oxford University, who was critical of several. You found one, and you're doing what you did on Brexit. It's the Patrick Minford paradigm, as Emily Maitlis described it. Every economist in the world thinks Brexit is a stupid idea, but we found one who doesn't. So we're going to give him exactly as much airtime and attention as all of the others. Well, this Hennigan dude fell into that kind of category. You'd have most or almost all public health officials in the game persuaded. And don't forget, Starmer was calling for, as Mark in Tooting has reminded me, calling for a circuit breaker in the September that was being referred to in that original clip. And Boris Johnson started calling him names at the time instead of listening to the wisdom. And that chap, that Hennigan chap, he pops up in the next clip, or at least he is referred to in the next clip. Have a listen to this.
During the course of that debate, I think you and Dame Angela McLean WhatsApped each other. Could we have, please, 207199? We are only concerned with the WhatsApps at the top of the page dated the 20th of September, because that's the date of the meeting, of course, and they commence around about 5:30, and the meeting was in the afternoon. So, Professor, these are plainly WhatsApps sent during the course of the meeting. Dame Angela McLean refers to, are we going to bring up the Seattle fishing vessel? Was that a reference to data gleaned from a fishing boat where a number of seamen had been shown to have antibodies
and were well protected,
earlier infected. Angela McLean, who is this John Edmonds, every statistic is wrong. Angela McLean, Patrick and Chris will discount him later. Were those all references to the proponents of the contrary side of the debate?
I'm pretty sure it's your next witness.
Professor Hennahan. All right. And during the course of this WhatsApp stream, we can also see a reference to Dr. Death, the Chancellor, and Dame Angela McLean saying, in ONS, you'd see it. Did you understand that those were references to the Eat Out to Help Out campaign, of which you've spoken about in moderately?
Honestly, it's so long ago, I don't know.
All right.
But it could well be.
So the bloke that was being pumped up as some sort of counterpoint to the experts described there, well, it was bleeped out. I'll let you speculate on what you think that might have been. And the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was being carried shoulder high by Tories through Westminster, metaphorically speaking, for his Eat Out to Help Out scheme, was called Dr. Death by the woman who subsequently became the government's chief scientific advisor. I don't have the words. I don't have the words to tell you how mad this is. I didn't even know it was going to be as mad as it is. I said to Eleanor, the producer, earlier today, we need to play some of these clips. We really need to get this out there. This is stuff that really, really matters, you know? And now I've listened to it again, and I'm reflecting on the fact that as far as we're aware, certainly as recently as October the 2nd, which is the last reference we can find, Rishi Sunak hasn't handed over his WhatsApp messages. He won't tell us what he was being told about his schemes before he introduced them. Boris Johnson hasn't handed over his WhatsApp messages, as far as we know. Have a think about that. The Chancellor of the Exchequer and the Prime Minister, at a time of epic national peril, where they stand accused by people who really know what they're talking about of making appalling decisions, are still keeping their own communications secret. And the chances of you reading about it in your morning newspaper are pretty slim, because at the same time your morning newspaper owners were putting pressure upon the Prime Minister and the Chancellor of the Exchequer to prioritise newspaper sales over public health. I still haven't got a phone-in topic. Thomas Watts has your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
36 minutes after 11 is the time. I don't know if it's even appropriate to take calls, but we won't rule it out, and we certainly won't be looking away from this story as it unfolds. And I'm sorry that I haven't jumped in it sooner, perhaps. Here's a tweet that really pins it, I think, really just nails it. The mysteries that we puzzle over together every day on this programme, but I can't get past it, says Jude. The fact that the sitting Prime Minister is described as Dr. Death by the woman who's now the government's chief scientific advisor, and it's somehow not dominating all the headlines. How is that? I mean, it could be a topic there. Just think about it. The Daily Mail did 14 front pages about Keir Starmer having a perfectly legal curry. Best part of 14. I forget precisely. The best part of a fortnight. The man who's currently running the country took a decision that saw him described as Dr. Death by the woman who's currently the government's chief scientific advisor. And you probably didn't know about it until you tuned into me today. Or unless you spend as much time as I do on Twitter. 11:37 is the time. It's absolutely incredible. Sue knows what I'm talking about. Hello, James. Yesterday, my dad asked me, does anybody have any idea why the English news media are completely ignoring the horrendous evidence being presented to the COVID inquiry? We know why. He lost his wife of 60 years in early January 2021. The decision not to lock down earlier directly precipitated her death. She went into hospital after a fall and caught COVID from an asymptomatic patient. She never came home. I'll read you this on a very different note, and nowhere near as upsetting, Sue. I'm so sorry for your loss. Hi, I don't think this chap's been in touch with me before, and the text is constructed in a way that is not common for text coming into the programme. He writes, hi, my name is Barry Rimington. I was the landlord of the Greater Good Inn in Fovant, Wiltshire. We did not run the Eat Out to Help Out deal, and our village hated us for that. My wife Catherine was a nurse and said this is madness and will cause a huge problem with COVID infections. We really were blackballed by the locals because they missed out on cheap meals. Rishi Sunak should be banged to rights for the people that died because of his thoughtless initiative. And yet I began this hour by wondering whether he will be. I don't see that he will be. Why not? I mean, is that the question? Should we ask on behalf of Sue's dad, why is most of the English news media completely ignoring the horrendous evidence being presented to the COVID inquiry? 0345 6060 973. Provided you with some answers, provided you with some possible answers. But I can't provide you with all the answers. It's absolutely breathtaking. And Sarah again adds to the question of why Rishi Sunak hasn't handed his WhatsApp messages over to the inquiry, and also why he hasn't been compelled to. I thought we were talking a couple of months ago about how they would have the power to force it to happen. Steve takes up the same point. Now we know why Sunak doesn't want his WhatsApp messages being read out. It's so politically damaging it could affect his electoral chances, which can't, on the current form, and certainly after yesterday's by-elections, which can't get much worse. What if you're bereaved? What if you're grieving? Are you following this really closely and sitting there wondering why the news media isn't? We couldn't talk about anything but COVID for months upon months upon months upon months upon months. And now some of those mysteries are being solved. Why is so much of the newspaper industry committed to turning down the measures, turning down the protections? Why? And now you know, because a former political editor of the Daily Mail was sending WhatsApps to his boss in Downing Street, explaining that they were really, really worried about the impact it was all having on newspaper sales. So got to get people back to the office. This is breathtaking. And yet. Colin's in Leeds. Colin, what would you like to say?
Hi, I'd like to say that for me, they've already got away with it. They will always get away with it unless we have major change. I mean, Dr. Death himself is now Prime Minister.
Yeah.
Right? So how else can you not get away?
Stop. Just say that again.
Dr. Death himself is now Prime Minister.
Oh, don't be so silly. Who called him Dr. Death? It's probably one of your lefty mates, isn't it?
Yeah, exactly.
Dame Angela McLean, the government's chief scientific advisor, sent a secret message calling Rishi Sunak Dr. Death the Chancellor. And he's now Prime Minister.
Yeah. His party knew that. This is an unelected Prime Minister by even his own party. Yeah. But yet his party knew that he was known as Dr. Death by a scientist.
I don't know that they did, actually. I mean, don't put me in the position of having to defend him. But I think this has only come out because the inquiry has managed to get hold of messages that the people both receiving and sending them thought. It's probably the first Rishi Sunak's ever heard of it. But possibly, messages they didn't think would see the light of day. But that leads us inexorably to the question of why Rishi Sunak hasn't handed over his WhatsApp messages.
Mm-hmm. It's because nobody polices them, really. Every government, in my lifetime anyway, that has done something that you would consider majorly wrong, they police themselves. You know, they never actually get responsibility, whether you're talking about Margaret Thatcher's government or Tony Blair's government. You know, he went to an illegal war, and he's not only got away with it, he got back involved in politics when it came to Brexit. You know, no politician seems to
I thought I was disillusioned.
It's just.
No, you make perfectly valid points. I don't know who makes the decisions, Colin, and I'm sort of in the industry in my own small way. Who makes the decisions? You know, I know who makes the decisions about what appears on the front page of the Daily Mail, but to think I'm going to pretend that Keir Starmer's curry is comparable in any way to any of this. And of course, all the newspapers were in favour of the Iraq war as well. Jack Straw gave an interview the other day where he said, obviously, in retrospect, it was a mistake. And I thought that's such an interesting contribution to public discourse because it's true and yet nothing happens.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing happens.
Yeah, nothing ever. And it's the only job that you can think about. Even like if you look at celebrities, or people who do a job like yourself, you got to be so careful on how you word stuff and how you say stuff, because your job could be gone the next day. Because if you say the wrong thing, you do the wrong thing. Unless
the right-wing newspapers didn't want me to be out of my job, in which case they'd circle the wagons. I sometimes think it is much simpler than we allow. I really do. Colin, thank you. I just want to hear one more voice before the next junction. Take one more call at least. And a couple more texts. James has been in touch from Liverpool. I listen to you every day. It's tough today. What they're getting away with is quite unreal. Thank you for highlighting it when others choose not to. Hey, look, we all got stuff wrong during lockdown. And what Colin just referred to, that rabid, not just legacy media, but social media, that rabid sort of mob of people desperate to pull down anyone they didn't like already for saying the wrong thing about something during COVID, made everything worse. Everything worse. But these are the people who were in charge. And obviously Colin's description of the Gulf War as illegal is filed under opinion. No charges were ever brought. He certainly wasn't ever found guilty. Tony's in Greenock. Tony, what would you like to say?
Hi, James. Thanks for taking the call. Looking forward to reading your book, by the way.
Oh, fantastic. November the 2nd. Roll up.
I'll read it on the plane to Australia when I'm flying over to see my daughter.
Oh, lovely stuff.
Yeah. No, the point I was trying to make to your producer is this is just a public inquiry. It's not any kind of legal prosecution. If it was, these guys would be in for manslaughter at the very least for the actions that we're hearing about. And the other question your producer put to me, it's an indictment of the media that we have in this country, that it is so silent. Now, what's happened in the Middle East... It's
actually incredible.
No, yeah, and the only thing I can think of is that what's happened in the Middle East has given them a great excuse to what was the phrase, to hide bad news.
I don't think so. I mean, today's papers have got loads of other stuff in them, and remember, newspapers have got 30, 40 pages. Yeah, it's a conscious decision not to cover this in anything like the depth you would expect them to.
It's all over social media, which is a saving grace, I guess.
Yes, it is.
The complete lack of it lack of any scrutiny from the likes of Sky or BBC or any of the mainstream channels.
The Beeb must be doing something. I mean, Sky and the BBC. I would have thought they were our best chances, present company accepted, of getting this properly looked at. Actually.
Well, you would think so, but
they usually have a
radio silence on that.
My bugbear is the newspapers, but the Beeb are doing all right on this. I mean, they're doing all right online. I don't know how much of it translates into bulletins because none of us can watch them all. But it's all out. They're putting it all out there. Rishi Sunak called Dr. Death by top scientists. They posted that 16 hours ago. But unless it's leading the 10, it's not going to be heard about, is it?
I guess the onus then falls upon the likes of...
And actually, sorry, I'm being a right old pedant now. Sky News are uploading the whole thing onto their YouTube channel. So, I mean, there are some of us trying to get it out there, but the newspapers set so much of the agenda that if they're completely ignoring it, so are most of the public.
I guess, and as I was trying to say there, I think the onus falls on someone like Keir Starmer to start raising these questions to Prime Minister's questions.
Well, that's a really interesting point. Can I mention who's presenting the show on Monday yet, or are we keeping it quiet? So the day I can tell. Well, I don't know. Are you busy? I'll take. Well, there's someone in the chair on Monday to whom you might want to bring many of these points, and I'll tell you who it is after this.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It's 10 to 12. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC, and I am, for once, I think, going to remember to solve the riddle that I left you with just before we headed off into the last junction, because Wes Streeting, the Shadow Secretary of State for Health, will be presenting this programme on Monday. And while I wouldn't want to queer anybody's pitch, I would suggest that you bring to Wes's attention some questions about the evidence that's emerging at the COVID inquiry and how the Labour Party plans to run with it. On Tuesday, Angela Rayner will be in the chair. On Wednesday, Carol Vorderman. On Thursday, the former Defence Secretary Ben Wallace. And on Friday, the former Chancellor of the Exchequer, Sajid Javid. So not a bad roster of holiday cover that I'm sure you will treat with the warmth and generosity that have come to typify this programme over the years that we've been doing it together. We return now to fraught territory. We return to the case of Jimmy Lai, still imprisoned, and still, I don't want to say benefiting Sebastian, who is Jimmy's son, but still subject of your tireless campaigning for his release. What's changed since we last saw you?
So a few unfortunate anniversaries. One is the 1,000th day that he's been in prison. His trial has been delayed for the fourth time now to December the 18th, and he's almost 76. So, I do worry that my father could die in jail.
What information do you get about his health and how he's bearing up?
So AP, I can't go back to Hong Kong because I speak out on my father's behalf. But AP Associated Press released photos of him, and it was the first time I had seen him in 3 years. He seems to be, he seems to be doing okay. A lot skinnier now, a lot sort of more tanned, I guess. But it was just a very weird feeling because it made me realize that he is at that age where, most people would be retired, and but also I was also very happy to see him, which was a bit perverse because I hadn't seen him in 3 years, and this is my father, and I'd really want to see him again.
Of course you do. It sounds as if his vulnerability hit you for the first time, or hit you harder than it ever had done before, because he's such a big character and such an ebullient man that you sometimes struggle to think of people like that as having any vulnerabilities at all. Yeah, I think. I mean, I think for anyone really, seeing their father in cuffs is a very hard image. He is in jail, for people who don't know or who can't remember, under Hong Kong's security law and a colonial-era sedition law. His offence effectively was to publish a pro-democracy newspaper called Apple Daily. We should talk, before we turn to the question of what the Foreign Office and the UK government is doing, we should talk about the case of the Australian television journalist Cheng Lai, who was being held on, in similar circumstances for 3 years, and the Australian government, I think, have intervened. Yeah, and I think that this is a perfect example of how speaking out for one citizen not only means that you could get that citizen released, but also shows that you care about citizenship, you care about your own people. You show strength in the face of tyranny. And it secured the release of the journalist. It secured the release of the journalist, and there hasn't been, from my understanding, blowback in Australia. In fact, they've shown that they are worthy partners on the same level as China. So your dad is a British national. He is in a foreign jail, and you have been pleading with the Foreign Secretary, currently James Cleverly, pleading with the government simply. I know there's some things you can't talk about for reasons of personal safety, but you can talk about this. All you are asking is that he calls publicly for your dad's release. Exactly. And he joins the call for my father's release because the US have called for my father's release. I'm not being glib, Sebastian, but your dad is not a US national. No, my father's not a US national. From the day he escaped China on a boat at 12 by himself, arriving in Hong Kong, which was a British colony, he has only ever had a British papers. He's only ever been recognized as a person by the British state. He fled communist oppression for British democracy. Exactly. For these values that we hold true, and for these values that he decided to stay in his 70s to defend and to go to prison for. What other international calls have there been for his release? The EU Parliament has called for his release. The EU Parliament, again, I'm not being glib, but since 2016 he ceased to be an EU citizen as well, didn't he? Exactly, yeah. But they've called for his release. They have called for his release. The UN Special Rapporteurs have called for his release. And again, I think I had a very emotional meeting actually with a Canadian, high-level Canadian diplomat. And when I do these things and I tell my father's story and what he has done and whatnot, I have this bit. And the diplomat interrupted me, and he said, "Look, Sebastian, I know the story. I know your father's a good guy. I'm on side."
And I almost cried. I almost cried because I go to the UK and a lot of parliamentarians, Lords, MPs have been incredibly supportive. And I met David Lammy and Catherine West recently, but it really seems like the government the current government isn't listening, isn't calling for his release. And then it dawned on me, it doesn't matter what great thing he has or hasn't done, whether we think that he should have stood up for freedom or not. He's a UK citizen. It's the responsibility of the government, no matter who it is. And that passes on to every single UK citizen.
Well, that's the point. I think that perhaps is missed because, someone living in Hartlepool isn't going to think of themselves as the equivalent of someone living in Hong Kong, but that's where nationality kicks in. That's precisely what you're so frustrated by. I'll read you the response we got from the Foreign Office when we put these questions to them, specifically the question of why there has been no call, no echo even of American and EU calls for your father's release. As the Foreign Secretary made clear last month in his report to Parliament on Hong Kong, British national Jimmy Lai's prosecution has been highly politicised. Mr. Lai and others are deliberately targeted to silence criticism under the guise of national security. The Foreign Secretary raised Mr. Lai's case with his counterpart as a matter of priority in Beijing in August, and the Minister for the Indo-Pacific met his son Sebastian last month to continue discussion of his father's case, which is, as is often what happens when we put questions to government ministries. It's not actually an answer to the question that we asked, but you did meet with Anne-Marie Trevelyan, I think. Yeah, and I met her for a few times, and again, very supportive, but look, the point is it's a pretty binary thing. You either call for his release or you don't call for his release. I think in the light of what's happening in Australia, what Australia has done, they have shown that calling for his release is the only way to see that person released, see Chang Lei released. I mean, that should be a very obvious thing. Well, I've asked you this before, and I doubt you've got a more sort of rounded answer than you had then. Why do you think this is? Why do you think the UK government is not following the lead specifically of the Australian government in the case of an incarcerated citizen, or simply the political lead of America and the EU Parliament, given that it should be the other way around. It should be the Americans saying, well, he's British, why are we going to get involved? It 100% should be. I don't know, but again, I think it is worrying because I'm also a British citizen. I mean, you're also British citizen. Yes. This is about the promise that we have on our passport. The words on the front page. The words on the front page. And it hasn't been kept. That promise hasn't been kept for your dad. How many times have you sought a meeting with James Cleverly? So I've been trying to meet him for 10 months, and I've also tried to meet with Rishi Sunak. Any specific responses from either of them? Any responses to your multiple requests for a meeting? Still pending. Which I think is. So you'd be happy never to meet them at all if they called on the Chinese authorities for Jimmy's release. 100%. But 100%, you think that by meeting them, you might hopefully bring some pressure to bear upon them that will move them to a place that they're currently reluctant to arrive. Exactly, and sort of help them understand the case of my father and why it's so important to call for a British citizen's release who's unjustly detained abroad. Is there anything else you want to get out there while you've got the benefit of this little platform? I just wanted to say how grateful I am to have this platform. I didn't mean that. I meant anything you want to bring. No, I know, of course, but it's been because we've been having so much support from civil society, journalist community, and I just wanted to say that I take none of that for granted. Well, I tell you what, you should take for granted is the thing you just referred to in your passport. This is from Jules, and she writes, OMG, we lived in Hong Kong for many years and we all read Apple daily. It was a centrist paper, effectively, not radical at all. Albeit, even if it was radical, it shouldn't get locked up for being the owner of it. If pro-democracy was radical, then it was radical. Precisely. We have Australian passports. We've always told our kids never to give them up and always to ensure they get an Australian passport for their kids and their kids. And the subtext of what she's writing is that Australian passport keeps its promises more powerfully than your dad's British one. I think people and nations are judged on their actions. And, from the case that we just mentioned, it really does seem to be the case. Sebastian, thank you and good luck. I know you're back in the air on this tide. Actually, how are you? How do you look after yourself? I'm
It's a bit of a roller coaster.
Of course
but,
it is.
Look, I think in the end of the day, I'm just a son trying to free his father, and I always have this image of my father when he was first arrested in August 2020, and he was released on bail before being rearrested. But the first time he was arrested, he came back and told us to not be scared, not fear, because he decided to stay in Hong Kong. And then someone asked him, Jimmy, do you regret what you've done? Do you regret doing this, being pro-democracy through all these hard times? And he thinks about it for a second, and he says, lying there in the jail cell, I look back in the last 30 years and think to myself, would I have done anything differently? And he smiles and he says, not one bit. So I keep doing this with a clean conscience and just like the one that my father had, and so I hope to see him again one day.
And you have no way of knowing how much he knows about how hard you're working on his behalf.
No, but I think some things between father and son, it's just you don't really have to call that out. I think he knows. I think he knows how much I love him.
Wow, he'd obviously be incredibly proud of you.
Thank you,
Sebastian. I just really, really, really hope that the next time we see each other, we'll have rather more cheerful conversations. I really do. It's 2 minutes after 12.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
It is 6 minutes after 12, and you are listening to James O'Brien on LBC. That roster for next week, once again, on Monday, Wes Streeting. On Tuesday, Angela Rayner. On Wednesday, Carol Vorderman. On Thursday, Ben Wallace. And on Friday, Sajid Javid. So this is the last hour that we will spend together for a week or so. Try not to miss me too much, won't you? I shall endeavour to do the same. We're going a bit rogue now. We're going to go down a completely different route, which I don't... And I make you a promise now, as soon as I'm back from my brief holiday, we will be keeping a very close eye on the COVID inquiry, a closer eye than perhaps we've managed to do so far. So the story that popped up in the news bulletin yesterday, it's so long since my children were born now that some of the stuff that used to be constantly in my mind isn't there anymore. I'm not making a big deal out of it. It's called getting older or just literally growing up. But for example, if there was a story about fertility treatment in the news, my ears would prick up because we had it twice successfully. And if we hadn't, my entire life would be different. Not worse, not better, but different. I can't quite imagine it being better in any way, but it would. So whenever that word appeared in the news or whenever I was reading something, I was particularly interested in it. And that's why yesterday, when the story about add-ons being offered to patients in the UK being better regulated, so a new ratings system from the fertility regulator is being introduced following concerns that clinics are offering unproven treatments that cost hundreds or thousands of pounds. My ears pricked up because I thought, oh, that's interesting. And then they pricked up again, if you can do double pricking, because I thought, crikey, it's a fertility story, and I didn't respond to it personally. I didn't have the me bit of it, which was weird for me. It's the first time I've noticed that happening, but it probably happened years ago. I just no longer immediately remember my personal investment in stories about fertility treatment. And then I started remembering stuff. So some of this is quite medical. The problem is, and I want you to talk to me about this. The problem is that you are so desperate. You're so desperate that you'll do anything. And we did. This is what I want to explore today. And some of the stuff I'm going to share with you is quite funny. But it all came from a place of aching need, which I presume is, I usually even greater for a woman than for a man. The urge, which not all women have, but if you have it, the urge to be a mother, and it is being frustrated by biology or circumstance or anything at all, that becomes an unbearable weight. And I know what that weight feels like. I watched my wife carry that weight, and I carried a bit of that weight myself. And it's one of those subjects, it's one of those classic subjects that you know everything about or nothing. Infertility never crosses your mind. Yeah, well, actually, oddly, because I'm adopted, partly because of fertility problems my dad had, well, not partly, entirely. You could make a case for me being the first inherited case of infertility in the history of humanity, but it would be a scientifically quite bogus case. So I never thought that it would happen to me any more than anybody ever thinks it would happen to them. And then it does, and you know nothing about it. You know absolutely nothing about it until you suddenly need to know everything. And what you do know when the hammer drops, what you do know is a sense of desolation. A sense of desolation that is almost impossible to communicate. I got it over the phone. I gave a sample. I don't want to go into too much detail. People are having their lunch, but I provided a sample to a clinic, and I was still quite relaxed about it. I thought it was all, there's nothing wrong. We just need to be a bit more patient. But my wife had done all her tests, and she was absolutely fine. And looking back now, I think she knew that there was probably going to turn out to be something wrong with my sperm. But it's not a very easy conversation to have. So you just gently encourage your partner to go to the clinic and have a test. So I sort of swan in there after the show one day, provide a sample, and go home. And they phoned me with the results. And I forget what the numbers were precisely, but they said a number. And it was the amount of sperm per milliliter or whatever it was. And it was, as a Kidderminster Harrier fan, where we're lucky to get 2,000 at a home game, right? It sounded like quite a big number to me. And then they said, well, the average is, and the number that they said was the average involved sticking several noughts on the end of the number that applied to me. So it was clear in a blink of an eye, it was clear in an instant that I had a fairly major problem going on. And then it emerged that even the paltry amount of active sperm that I did have, quite a lot of the little fellas were doing the backstroke, which is absolutely no use to anybody. So we were in, immediate medical need of intervention, applied instantly for the NHS, looked at the waiting list and thought, well, if we can scrape the cash together for this, the sooner we get going, the better. And that is what we did. But we also did everything that was suggested. And I think that some of it probably is efficacious. It didn't work. It didn't improve my sperm. So we did some treatments that were designed to improve my sperm, including acupuncture, which I really enjoyed, but it didn't make any difference to my sperm. And the one I most remember, I went to some kind of new age dude, right? I haven't thought about this in nearly 20 years. I went to some new age dude and he made me take my clothes off. So I'm standing there in my Homer Simpson underpants, which if I'd known I was going to have to take my trousers off, I would not have worn my Homer Simpson underpants. You know when you're getting towards the back of the pants drawer and you haven't done your laundry for it? So I'm standing there, somewhere up sort of Harley Street way. I'm standing there in my Homer Simpson underpants. And this dude, he's got what I can only really describe as an unravelled wire coat hanger. And do you remember in comics when we were kids, they thought they could do water divining. So you would walk around with two rods and I think it actually works. I think there might be, don't ring me about water divining. This is far too sensitive a subject for your nonsense. And the rods would move towards each other when you found yourself above a water source or something like that. I can't remember all the details, but I think he was doing that with my body. He told us, and God knows how much we paid. Seriously, you could have sold me magic, but you could probably have sold me Brexit at that stage in my life if you'd said it was going to improve our chances of having a baby. And I think he was sort of undoing blockages or something with this metal coat hanger while I'm standing there in my Homer Simpson boxer shorts. That's what desperation looks like. And then, same bloke, I think, or it could have been another one. I remember how serious he was as well. He said, you need mare's milk. And I thought, what? And he said, mare's milk. So he'd done all these things with the coat hangers and stuck a lollipop stick in my mouth and shone a light into my ears and all this sort of thing. And then he sort of, we got to the quotes, prescription end quotes bit of it. And he said, mare's milk. And I said, you mean a horse? And he went, yes. Okay. I mean, you can't really say, where am I going to get horse's milk from? Because the answer is quite obvious, isn't it? A horse. But I don't have a horse. And I don't know what the score is. It's not like cows, is it? You don't. A horse generally gives all its milk to its own foal. You don't have excess horse's milk knocking around. You don't see it in budgeons, do you? Next to the oat milk and the almond milk. I'll have half a pint of horse's milk, please. And so I can laugh about it now, but I'm not sure I laughed about it then. So I then embark upon a quest for horse's milk. And the only place, and he'd said it so casually, as if it was such a normal thing. I thought I'd just be able to find it in one of those whole food shops, that are quite popular. They always smell a bit weird. You know the ones I mean? They're very popular now, but we're going back 18 years. They weren't that popular then. There are places that sell things like hemp ice cream and stuff. I thought, they'll have horse's milk. So I went into a couple and they looked at me as if I was asking for crack cocaine or something like that. Or no, it'd be easier to get hold of crack cocaine than it would have been horse's milk, especially in the part of West London we lived in at the time. But they looked at me as if I was asking for unicorn tears. I might, or indeed unicorn milk. I might as well have asked for unicorn milk. I go, hello. I sort of make my way past the mung beans, and I say, I don't suppose you've got any horse's milk, have you? And they said, but I said, mare's milk, the milk of a mare. And no, they didn't have anything like that. So I found it online, and there was a place in France that sold frozen horse's milk. Was it either frozen or powdered? I forget which. And I was looking into it, and I thought, well, I'll order some of that. And I needed some sort of veterinary license because it would have been before Brexit, so maybe I'm misremembering it. But the point was, no one had ever bought it for human consumption. So even with my rudimentary French during the email exchange, when I revealed that I wanted to drink it myself, it was almost like an alarm bell went off in southern France, and they ghosted me from that point onwards. I'd just been trying to buy this, trying to get a supply of horse. So this story is very serious about the things you've done in order to have a baby that, looking back, were highly unlikely to help. But how was that even allowed to happen? How can some dude be swanning around central London telling people to buy something that is impossible to source unless you've got a horse, I suppose, that's recently given birth? Absolutely incredible. But there we are. So that's not really what this story is about, although it is in terms of what this phone-in is about. So if you've been through similar experiences, and I tell you what, basically this phone-in, the half of this phone is I give you horse's milk. Beat that. 0345 6060 973. I'm not that up on the female equivalents, but I hope you can laugh about it now. I fully understand if you can't. But when you go to these clinics where you are hemorrhaging money on an almost unbelievable scale, they provide you with things that sound and feel a lot more medically correct than a pint of horse's milk and an unbent old wire coat hanger. So the things that have got red ratings, and a red rating conveys the idea that you probably shouldn't be paying for this. The already stressful process of buying private fertility treatment is rendered even more stressful when you're told about all the add-ons, the optional, non-essential treatments that they make you think will improve your chances. Fertility Network UK have brought in a rating system which uses 5 colours ranging from green to red to indicate the amount of evidence an add-on is effective at improving the chances of having a baby. So red is bad, obviously, and it includes things like immunological tests, that's rated red, pre-implantation genetic testing for aneuploidy PGTA, where a cell is removed from the embryo and tested for chromosomal abnormalities, that's rated red. So 90 minutes after 12, what do you think fits into probably shouldn't bother with that territory? So you've got the very serious, where you've spent an awful lot of money on something that sounds very scientific, and then you've got the very silly, which is where the horse's milk goes. And all of this is underpinned by my deep understanding of how absolutely desolate this period of your life can be. And for many people, unlike me and my wife, it doesn't end joyously, it doesn't end joyfully. And that, I think, is why it's important, because they're taking advantage of desperation, I think. I'd like to be reassured that they're not, but I think that they probably are. So this conversation will be as serious or as light-hearted as you like. It depends on what's happened in your life. But we're looking at things that you've done in the hope of getting pregnant or in the hope of getting your partner pregnant, that you look back on now and think that was probably not worth it. 0345 6060 973.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
23 minutes after 12. I don't think this is very nice. Dear James, I've got a bridge I want to sell you. Yes, but that is a gullibility in normal life. I think taking advantage of your desperation to become a parent. I'm reminded a little bit of a conversation we had about funerals not long after I lost my dad, where I just found myself thinking, does anyone ever haggle? But you're in such a state of emotional distress that they say, that'll be £5,000, please, or that'll be £200. And you go, well, that's absolutely fine. No, I'll just go and get an overdraft. I'll just go and buy. It's just got a similar feel to it, as you would never think of going, hang on a minute, I can get that in Sainsbury's for £22.50. Absolutely. That's all we're talking about. The things in pursuit of pregnancy that perhaps deserve to be filed under either exploitation or excess. Emily's in Tottenham. Emily, what would you like to say?
Hi, James.
Hello.
Hi. So my boys, I've spoken to you before, are a result of 8 IVFs and
Yes.
40 grand.
That's a wry chuckle, isn't it, Emily? That's a wry
Yeah.
chuckle. But worth every penny. But
worth every penny,
yeah, of course.
But I did a lot to get pregnant. And I was really involved in that kind of what do you do to make IVF work kind of field. You know, I was on all the forums, women kind of exchange information. Apparently, if you eat this will help. Apparently, in the end, I did intralipids. Now, who knows whether intralipids are going to work? They're made of soya and egg white, so we call them mayonnaise babies. But you can get them. Yeah, you can get.
I think you're younger than me. These are recent developments, but I'm sure that we'd have signed up for them if they'd been around at the time.
But no, I'm the same age. I'm 50. I was 50 last year.
Okay.
Yeah. So, but I'm very in this IVF world. Well, I was.
Clearly.
I'm not now. So these intralipids, they cost about £5 or £6 from the pharmacy.
Right.
But the fancy clinics in London will charge £160, £200 to administer them. So I got told I needed them, and then now I need to pay this intralipid fee. But I asked them for a prescription and then went to a pharmacy, bought them, and then found an IV nurse and gave her 40 quid and bought a giving kit and basically got them for like 50 quid a time, because you need them throughout your pregnancy if you get pregnant. So... But women, you know, when you're spending £5,000-6,000 on an IVF cycle, you think, well, maybe if I just spend another £500 on eating, 12 pineapples a day, because pineapples help with implantation, supposedly. So when I was in Prague doing my IVF, I went out into the middle of Prague looking for fresh pineapples.
How many did you eat?
I ate about 3 in the 2 days I was in Prague.
Well, and was that the round that worked?
Yes.
Well, there it is.
Yeah.
That's science, that is, Emily.
That's the science. I know. The thing is with IVF, you know, you're so invested. You're down this tunnel. You'll do anything.
Tell me about it.
You're spending so much money, and you're with a sort of a group of women who none of us are doctors, well, some of us are, but, you know, we're just sharing information. It's like, well, this lady, it worked for her. Apparently eat turmeric, don't eat brown bread, only eat white bread, eat strawberries, don't eat tomatoes. It's full on. But when you think of all the women who get pregnant naturally in the world and they live off a diet of, you know, wine and cigarettes and chocolate.
Monster Munch.
Actually being that healthy is not actually a great thing for when you're doing IVF, and that's the whole thing. So there's two kind of thoughts regarding IVF and how you should be, and one of them is what's the guy called, the famous guy with I forget his name. One of them's Zeta West, and one of them's the other guy, whose names I can't remember, and they both have very different approaches to how your body works in IVF.
I think both of the people you're referring to are you know, everything they do is done in good faith, and probably almost all of it is. But if you're running a private clinic, and someone says, "Oh, there's a whiz-bang new scheme, and we're charging 1,500 quid a pop for it," the temptation to sign up for it without establishing beyond reasonable doubt that it's worth it is commercial, isn't it? I mean, it's.
That's what I did. I spent £1,500 on getting the Chicago test for my blood, and they took 16 vials of blood. And then I went home in a tube and ate a cereal bar because I was so like, oh my goodness.
And was that worth it?
Well, yes, because that told me, that information from those 16 vials of blood that get sent to Chicago told the ladies at Zeta West that I need to lower my immune because I was so healthy. Right. Because I'm eating all the healthy food because I want to get pregnant. I was so healthy, my body was killing the embryos that were going inside of me.
Oh, the mind boggles.
So I needed to lower my immune. Listen, I had a glass of wine the night before embryo transfer. In IVF world, that's crazy.
And everyone would tell you not to. I mean, it is. Thank you. Yeah. I sense we could carry on all day. What was the maddest thing you heard of on your forums? What was the thing that made you go? What was your horse's milk moment?
There probably was horse's milk, but I can't. It was 8 years ago,
I should have set up. I missed a business opportunity there. If these people are still going around the place trying to promote the benefits of horse's milk, I should have opened up a little horse's milk salon. Emily, thank you. James is in Scarborough. James, what made you pick up the phone?
Oh, hi there, James.
Hello.
Thanks for taking the call. The second you started talking about this, I had to pick up the phone because myself and my wife have been through 8 rounds of IVF, which resulted in 6 transfers, and we've bought the extras. We've paid for the expensive extras. Yeah. Don't get me wrong, we've also eaten lots of pineapples. We've eaten lots of beetroot juice, crates of beetroot juice.
Making those bloody smoothies.
I know,
kale,
it's terrible when you go to the loo afterwards.
Well, you think you've got some sort of internal rupture, don't you, until you remember that you've eaten your own body weight in beetroot over the course of the last week. And the little, what was it, chia seeds or something like that.
Pineapple.
I was like a
seeds,
hamster.
Pumpkin seeds.
I was like a hamster, mate. I had the diet of a hamster, I think, at one point. Absolutely incredible. And what's the relationship between confidence and hope? So when they say to you, do this, do that, and then ask for money, you kind of think, we better do that then, just in case.
Well, exactly.
Oh.
It's like, me and my wife said to each other, it's like when you go on holiday to New Zealand, you're not going to moan about booking yourself into an airport lounge because you spend it $5,000 anyway, so what's an extra 150?
But it all adds up, doesn't it?
The thing is, we've used things such as embryo glue, which is 200 quid a go.
Right.
But ultimately, we had to go private because of our age.
Right.
And one of the things that the news articles talk about is a thing called PGTA testing, and it's ranked as red.
It is.
And this is where you do a fake round of IVF, and they take a cell from the embryo, which would have become the umbilical cord, and they test it. Now, we did that, and we discovered that around about half of the chromosomes were never going to allow the pregnancy to go to a full term, and we'd had a double miscarriage. So
that one worked. That one worked for you, even though it would not make much difference to the massive majority of people, which puts us straight back in the, well, better safe than sorry territory then, doesn't it?
Well, what it did is it told us that we needed to use donor eggs.
Wow.
Because we were never going to get pregnant with our own.
Gosh.
And then we forked out for a fake round of IVF at full cost,
right,
where they actually biopsy the lining of the womb to work out what's going on in there and will it implant. But look, at the end of the day, 2 weeks ago we had a positive pregnancy test with our final frozen egg. So,
I've got everything crossed for you, mate. Absolutely everything.
Well, our test, our scan that we're going to, it's a big day, 2nd of November. And I'll be seeing you shortly after that.
Oh, well, I look forward to that. I look forward to that, mate. I really do. And make sure you come and say hello. Yeah, do that. And I'll go, seriously, everything crossed. Yeah, for both of you, for all of you. Thank you, James. You take care. Tim Humphries here now with your headlines.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:37 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. Slight change of tone now. I had one of those moments yesterday. I haven't had many, I've got to be honest, where I'm scrolling through the infernal hell site that is Twitter, and my tummy turned over. I saw something that just made me go, oh, no way. And it involved the reported death of a cartoonist called Tony Husband, who you might be familiar with, whether you realise it or not, because in the last couple of years, Tony and I became pals over social media, and he started sometimes providing a sort of cartoon commentary on issues that we were discussing on the show, which I would then tweet I'd retweet his account, and I know that brought him into a lot of your lives, and for many of us, he was already there, probably chiefly through his work over decades on Private Eye magazine and a short-lived but desperately scurrilous little magazine called Oink that he both founded and edited. And he just had an ability, you probably, if you still don't know who I'm talking about, you probably know of his Yobs cartoon strip. And he just had an ability as a political cartoonist to capture moments with what appeared to be such sort of ease and simplicity that it almost belied the quality of the satire or the quality of the criticism, the critique that he was bringing into the mix. And so I was absolutely gutted when I saw it, not least because I was due to meet him in person for the first time next month up in Manchester. And of course, now I won't. Nick Newman is a cartoonist of similar stature and has just actually posted on Twitter a beautiful tribute to him, which draws upon the Yobs cartoon strip and imagines what would happen when Tony arrives at the pearly gates. And Nick joins me now. I mean, a massive shock. First of all, Nick, I think he was on his way to a Private Eye party, wasn't he? When
Yeah, we were absolutely devastated. We were having a sort of jolly on the Thames to mark the retirement of our managing director, Sheila Molnar. And Tony was worried. I mean, he was texting me all through the morning. His train had been cancelled. Then the train he did get from Manchester was delayed, and he was just saying, "Oh, I'm now at Stoke and I'm stuck out." And it was just, he was obviously very keen to get to this jolly, yes. And he didn't quite make it. He was sort of rushing over Westminster Bridge, and very tragically collapsed. So. We were all sort of waiting for him, and, we all missed him hugely. I was sort of sending him messages saying, we'll see you in the pub after, but it was unbelievably sad. Yes. And to cap it all, he sent me a cartoon he drew on the train, which is of him standing at Westminster Pier waving the boat goodbye, and it's so unbelievably poignant. And I think it's touched thousands of people, that, and that's the thing, the outpouring of love for his work, yes. on the dreaded Twitter. At last, it's done something good, Twitter.
Yes, well, but beyond the simple dissemination of the work, it emerged that, as with me, that he'd actually struck up what feel like friendships with people who he had contacted and who had contacted him via that medium, because we sometimes think of cartoonists, Nick, as sitting in a garret scrawling their misanthropic pictures for not as being extrovert or sociable. But Tony was clearly a man who revelled in human interaction and company.
Yeah, he made friends everywhere.
Yes.
I mean, that there was somebody on Twitter said, I bumped into him on a beach and he drew a cartoon for me on a pebble. He just sort of didn't stop drawing. And as a result, he loved meeting people, but he struck up friendships with all kinds of people, like, the Pythons, and, he was just... he once came to stay with me, and I was late getting home, and he was sort of standing outside the house in the rain. And my next door neighbour was a woman called Denise O'Donoghue, who then ran a very small TV production company called Hat-Trick. Mm-hmm. And Denise invited Tony in for a cup of tea. By the time I got home, and he'd left a message saying he was next door, he'd sold her a TV series called Round the Bend, which was this fabulous sort of kids TV series with puppets and stuff. Yeah. But he was just brilliant. He was so quick, and it's a great loss.
Finally, of course, a word on the work. Because cartoonists, and I'm obviously, like anybody sensible in this country, a huge fan of Private Eye. That it's hard to pick a uniting theme of good cartoonists, because you have different technical abilities. So some people do very simple line drawings, others do much more sophisticated cartoons. I mean, his work, you would spot a Tony Husband cartoon from 200 yards away, wouldn't you? But what is the essence of a brilliant cartoon, and why was he such a master of providing it?
Well, the BBC wrote a thing yesterday about him saying that he was a political cartoonist, which he really wasn't.
No.
He was brilliant at standalone cartoons, which are the hardest form of cartooning to do, because they're timeless. They're not particularly satirical. They can be, but Tony just came up with amazingly surreal, often very, very black ideas. I was trying to look at some cartoons to put on the Private Eye Twitter feed, and there's a page of his dedicated to him in a book I edited about Private Eye cartoons. And 3 of the cartoons on the page were about death, and Tony would have, I think, he'd probably found his own circumstances quite sort of black and macabre, and
he'd been through it, hadn't he? Because his son Paul had a heroin addiction, which they turned into an incredible book together.
And also, his dad suffered from dementia, and Tony did a very incredibly moving book about dealing with his dad. He had a great heart, which I know people sort of say sentimentally about people, but Tony really did.
It occurs to me listening to you. I mean, bloody funny, but it's a serious business cartoon.
Well, he didn't make it seem so.
No, well, clearly
he made it seem very effortless. He just churned out every issue. At least a dozen ideas would come in from him, and there would always be at least 3 that you could use straight off. And then there was Yobs as well, which just sort of ran on and on forever.
And never got tired as well, remarkably, because it's essentially the same joke every week, isn't it?
It is, but he managed to find twists and changes. Yes. I mean, one of my favourite cartoons of his was I think almost one of the very first gags he got into Private Eye, which inspired the Yobs cartoon strip, which was 2 skinheads scrawling graffiti on the wall, and one's obviously a National Front supporter, and he's saying, "How do you spell NF?" and I think that's what appealed to Ian Hislop, and he thought there might be a strip in this, and my goodness, there was. It's been running for 40 years.
Yes, I remember I used to read it at school. Which is, thank you, Nick Newman himself, a cartoonist par excellence, remembering his friend and colleague Tony Husband, who passed away yesterday. He sent me a canvas of one of his cartoons last month. A jiffy bag dropped through my letterbox at home. Condolences, of course, to all of his family, and you can see some of the tributes on my Twitter feed and elsewhere. 12:46.
James O'Brien on LBC. James O'Brien on LBC.
12:49 is the time. You're listening to James O'Brien on LBC. This is rather glorious, actually, and as Nick Newman was alluding to a moment ago, sometimes these social media sites can provide moments of true beauty. I don't know whether or not you heard Greg Hands this morning attempting to put a gloss on the Conservative by-election defeats yesterday, 2 of them. Last time the Tories lost 2 by-elections on the same day, of course, the Conservative Party chairman resigned, but that was the paragon of virtue, integrity and talent, Oliver Dowden, as opposed to Greg Hands. But anyway, here is one of the lines that he was spouting this morning.
I didn't hear a single person come to the door to say that despite all the problems people are facing, that Labour and Sir Keir Starmer was the solution to their problems. So I don't see any enthusiasm for Labour.
So there's no enthusiasm for Labour evinced by these humiliating by-election results in 2023. Do you remember 1997, when Labour stormed to power under Tony Blair? I listened to that comment from Greg Hands this morning, and I don't know, I just got a slight sense of déjà vu. I'm thinking back to the 1996 local elections, which also delivered extremely bad news to the governing Conservative Party. And in this clip, I want you to listen out for a cheeky young chap who may sound vaguely familiar.
What message do you have for the MPs who come out onto College Green, one saying one thing, another saying the other, the government's got to do this on Europe, the government's got to do that on Europe? It must be rather exasperating when you're trying to run the national union, isn't it?
Well, I think the message that we would give is this: that there is no enthusiasm out there for Mr Blair and his new reconstructed ersatz Labour Party. I mean, it is all false. In their heart of hearts, the voters
But
know
what are you
it.
going to say to your Conservative
But
MPs?
I'm saying to their Conservative MPs, that is our opportunity. Let's score some goals. The goal is wide open. It's all to play for. Let's go for it.
Here you are, a rather upbeat message from here in Central Office, even though they've lost 550 odd seats or so this evening. Back to you, David, in the studio.
I love that. I mean, it's actually, how many years are there? 23 years, 27 years have passed. And the Tories are greeting an electoral humiliation with almost exactly the same words that they greeted the last one. That was Robin Hodgson, who I forget whether he was party chairman or whether he was just a member of Parliament for Walsall North. Is it worth playing it again, or is it? I think have we delighted in that long enough? Because it is. No, let's do it again. Because have you worked out who the journalist is in the second clip? So here is Greg Hands dealing with suggestions that last night's results were quite good for Labour in 2023.
I didn't hear a single person come to the door to say that despite all the
Other one.
What message do you have for the MPs who come out onto College Green, one saying one thing, another saying the other, the government's got to do this on Europe, the government's got to do that on Europe? It must be rather exasperating when you're trying to run the national union, isn't it?
Well, I think the message that we would give is this: that there is no enthusiasm out there for Mr Blair and his new reconstructed ersatz Labour Party. I mean, it is all false. In their heart of hearts, the voters
But
know
what are you
it.
going to say to your Conservative
But
MPs?
I'm saying to their Conservative MPs, that is our opportunity. Let's score some goals. The goal is wide open. It's all to play for. Let's go for it.
Here you are, a rather upbeat message from here in Central Office, even though they've lost 550 odd seats or so this evening. Back to you, David, in the studio.
Back to you, James, in the studio. 1996, that was, of course. Not, and we fast forward now to 2023, when the Conservative chairman, Greg Hands, is trying to put a negative gloss on Labour's victory.
I didn't hear a single person come to the door to say that despite all the problems people are facing, that Labour and Sir Keir Starmer was the solution to their problems. So I don't see any enthusiasm for Labour.
Fantastic. And yes, well done, David. That is John Sopel there, looking very fresh-faced and cheeky. Proving that, what do they say? The world turns, but nothing ever changes. 12:53 is the time. I don't know if I'm going to have time for any more calls. I shall squeeze in Victoria in Aldershot on the IVF questions and the things we did in the hope of getting pregnant. Victoria, what made you pick up the phone?
Hi.
Hello.
Sorry, James, I've got a crying baby in the background.
Well, at least I know it worked.
It worked. I just wanted to comment. We've obviously had a success story with it. We actually had twin girls, which is amazing.
Yes.
But the whole way through, I was 36 when we started, and we were unexplained infertility. So there was no reason why we couldn't fall pregnant naturally. And we were being really pushed into taking all these tests and doing all these different things, which we declined to do. And I got a bit obsessed about my diet, like your first caller you had on earlier, obsessed about what I was eating and doing all the right things. And we had 5 failed rounds. And on the last round, as you can hear, it worked.
Through. It came good.
And that was the round I didn't change my diet. I still had my cup of coffee.
So you relaxed?
I relaxed. And it just shows that, these tests and all of these, you can get so caught up in it because you're so desperate.
Well, and they get you more stressed. I hadn't really clocked that bit until you rang in. Is because every time you're paying for something, you're ramping up your own stress levels. Not necessarily because of the money, but because you're thinking, oh, God, please, I hope this works. Oh, God, please, I hope that works. Oh, God, please, I hope that works.
You'll try anything.
Yeah, whereas the big dice is the implantation, isn't it?
It is exactly that.
Oh, happy days.
Yes, yeah. But that was. I better go. I'm so sorry.
Someone needs feeding, Victoria. Have a lovely week. Have a lovely weekend. 12:55 is the time, and I think we'll end this week with a little clip of Full Disclosure, which is with Tim Peake, which is it's a cracking interview. He's a really, really cool guy, Tim Peake, and so self-effacing. I tell you, the kind of men I admire most, and I think I mean men rather than people. The men I admire most are the ones that aren't very much like me. They're the ones that are just quietly brilliant. They just get on with it. They don't need to tell everyone how wonderful they are or do a lap of honour or draw attention to themselves. And, of course, Tim Peake, as a consequence of those qualities, ended up being the first British astronaut to spend time on the International Space Station. It's quite a life story, even though he would be far too modest to even believe that himself.
My wife and a friend of mine saw this advert at the same time and both called me and said, you've got to go for this. The European Space Agency are asking for astronauts and it's open to UK citizens. Yeah. So I thought, I looked at the qualifications required and it was like, tick, got that, yep, right age, right qualification. Wow, let's go for it. So I started this very lengthy application process.
Alongside 8,000 other people.
Yes, yeah. And embarked on a year long with the space agency, jumping through the various hoops that you have to jump through to get down and get selected.
And it's the same appeal, isn't it? It's the same combination of discovery and study. It's you're thinking this is it speaks to my enthusiasms and my skill set.
Yes, absolutely, and you've just got to be passionate about it. And nobody really knows what they're getting themselves into when you go for astronaut selection. Nobody really knows what does that mean. What does the job entail? Where are the ups and downs? What are the real pros and cons? Yes, you might end up flying to space and clearly becoming an astronaut, but that's the end of after many years of training. And where are we going to live as a family? All of these unknowns, and there aren't necessarily answers to that question. And I think part of the point is that if you're willing to embrace that level of uncertainty, you're dedicated and passionate enough to just grasp that opportunity and give it a go, then you're probably halfway there to having the right skill set to becoming an astronaut.
Even though you were, I think, certainly you'd have been in a very small minority, possibly a minority of one, for not having had a much longer ambition to be an astronaut. I think you've said that you had colleagues who'd been 4 or 5 years old and saying, I want to be an astronaut, and you not wanted, you wanted to be a pilot. But actually, having spoken to you the way that we have today, they're not that different.
No, they're not that different. To me, that's why, I never grew up saying I'm going to fly to space and be an astronaut. But actually, every time we go to space, it's a test sortie. When we do a spacewalk, it's a test flight. It's the same training. It's the same thing. We've got new pieces of equipment. We're pushing the boundaries. It's very much the same philosophy.
What is it in layman's terms then? It's a combination of exploring and recording for the people who come after you, is it?
In what respect? Sorry.
Well, in all of it, really. Everything you've done, you're at the forefront. You're a pioneer.
Yeah.
But the work you're doing will be of immeasurable benefit to
Yes.
to people coming after as well.
Yeah, and I think there is that, absolutely, that's the satisfaction.
I'm looking for the kind
you
of
get.
uniting theme.
Yeah, that's the satisfaction you get is making something, discovering something, making things work, making things more efficient, whether they're safer, and developing new techniques that other people can use. I love all of that stuff. Absolutely passionate about it.
And it's undimmed, isn't it? You still love it as much now as you did when you...
Absolutely.
Lovely bloke, really good interview. Even though I say so myself, that's Tim.
Marvellous interviewer.
That's just amazing. That's Tim Peake on this week's Full Disclosure, which you can download in from Global Player or all the usual places. Quick reminder of who is in the chair for me next week while I take a barely earned break. Wes Streeting here on Monday, Angela Rayner on Tuesday, Carol Vorderman making her. Is it her LBC debut on Wednesday as a presenter? I think it is. Ben Wallace on Thursday and Sajid Javid on Friday. If you missed any of today's show, you can listen back on Catch Up on Global Player, where you can also pause and rewind live radio. All of LBC's shows are there to catch up on, as well as the world's biggest podcasts, including Full Disclosure. Pause and rewind live radio on Global Player, where you're always in control. Download for free from your app store or head to globalplayer.com. Tom Swarbrick will be with you at 4, but now on LBC, it's time for Sheila Fogarty.
James O'Brien on LBC.